Our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is Colonel William Bill Weber, U.S. Army retired, veteran of World War II and the Korean War. He is also chairman now of the Korean War Veterans Memorial Fund. Colonel, it's an honor to have you. Thank you for your time today.
Yeah, it's a foundation, not fund.
Foundation, sorry. Let's begin at the beginning. Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Chicago, Illinois, raised through my early teens in Wisconsin, and my late teens in Alabama.
When and where did you join the service?
I enlisted on the 25th of February 1943 in Birmingham, Alabama.
And why did you choose the Army?
I was always oriented toward the Army. I had ROTC in high school. The Army was the only one that had parachutists, and that's what I wanted to be. So it was both a desired and a necessary choice.
So February 1943, where did the Army send you after you enlisted?
Well, I was only 17, so I went to what was called Army Specialized Training Program, which is the first year of college, basically. And when I reached 18, then I was allowed to go to basic training and advanced training and parachute school. So I spent the February through November of 1943 at Austin Peay State College at that point in time, studying engineering.
Okay, and then after that, what happened?
Well, basic training. I went to Camp McClellan, Alabama for basic training, and then to Fort Bragg with the 11th Airborne Division for advanced individual training, and from there to jump school.
Is airborne what you dreamed it would be?
I beg your pardon?
Was being in the airborne what you expected it to be?
Oh, yes, and more so, to be quite honest about it. In the 11th Airborne, the commanding general of that particular airborne division, General Swing, was a firm believer in dual qualifying all of his combat elements in the division, which meant you had to not only be qualified as a parachutist, but also as a gliderman. And generally speaking, people like to play having to ride in those rickety gliders. When you were assigned to the division, you had no alternative, however, because two of the regiments were called glider regiments, and the 3rd Regiment was a parachute regiment, even though, as I said, we were dual qualified. And in the 187 and 188, which were the two glider regiments, we did as much jumping as the 511 did, which was the parachute regiment.
So plenty of experience. When were you deployed to the Pacific?
Well, I went to OCS first at Fort Benning. I graduated as a second lieutenant in January of '45. Spent another month or two at Fort Benning going through demolition training and jump master training. Then I deployed to the Pacific, joined the 11th Airborne in Luzon in the Philippines.
And when did you get there?
Would have been late June '45.
Late June. So about a month and a half before the hostilities ceased.
Yeah, the war was in the process of winding down. There's no question about that, although we didn't know it at the time.
Sure.
There was, of course, a very real possibility, had it not been for the use of the atomic bombs, that the war would have continued into 1946 with the invasion of Japan. First invasion during November of '45 in Kyushu, and then in May of '46 at the Honshu Plain, with the targets being Tokyo and Yokohama.
What were your duties in the Philippines?
I was a platoon leader of a rifle platoon and a rifle company.
Was there, I mean, the Allies had retaken the Philippines by that time, so was there any sort of resistance or any threat facing the Philippines at that point?
Only bypassed individual Japanese groups and small soldier, one soldier or two at a time. There was no particular combat to speak of. I mean, they were easily policed up, to be quite honest about it, because most of them were starving. They had no ability to resupply themselves. They lived off the land or what they could steal from the Filipino people. However, they did resist. They didn't surrender.
What was your reaction when you heard about the use of the atomic weapons?
Well, I was basically just a 19-year-old young lieutenant. You know, these things were, at that point in time, far removed from our mind. We had no conception or perception of what an atomic weapon was. And when they said atomic bomb, it didn't really mean anything to us because we had no idea at that particular point in time the kind of damage and destruction that it would cause. Because the Japanese then sued for surrender, the 11th Airborne Division was alerted to be the first element into Japan to begin the occupation, since we were airborne and we were air transportable in that sense of the word. So we were moved from Lipa in the Philippines to Kadena Airstrip at Okinawa. And the Air Force, at that point in time, Army Air Corps, was assembling all of the C-54 aircraft worldwide to bring them to Okinawa, since they were the only aircraft that the Army Air Corps had at the time that would make the flight from troop-type aircraft. They would make the flight from Okinawa to Japan proper. And in early August, we were airlifted into Japan to a place called Tsugi Airstrip, which was located outside of Yokohama, halfway about between Yokohama and Tokyo. And we were combat loaded because nobody knew whether or not the Japanese were actually going to resist in their entirety. And we knew that the government had sued for surrender, but the Japanese military were a group unto themselves, basically, and they had deliberately and very aggressively resisted the attempt to have a peace achieved. At one point in time, a coup was attempted by young Japanese officers to take over the imperial palace, make the emperor a prisoner, and continue the war. The senior military leadership, of course, were aware of the fact that it would have been a slaughter. I mean, the Japanese, yes, they would have resisted, there's no question about it. But they were in a position where they had no resupply, no capability to improve their status at any point in time, and every loss that they took was irreplaceable. So the ultimate end was inevitable. But in the warrior culture, Bushido culture of the Japanese military, for them, to die in battle was preferable to surrender. So there was a lot of uncertainties whether or not the Japanese military in its entirety would obey the surrender instructions of the emperor. Fortunately for the United States, they did. And what could have been a prolonged but clearly obvious end to it, bloodbath, was avoided. In fact, the discipline of the Japanese military when we landed at Tsugi was unbelievable. The entire runways were lined on both sides with Japanese soldiers with their backs to the runway. And of course, as Americans, we had initially anticipated that that was a sign of anger or a sign of disrespect, not understanding the Japanese culture. As a matter of fact, it was a sign of respect. But they were still armed. It was, you know, a great deal of question in our mind. Would they stay that way? Would they remain in a position of respect? Or was it a ploy just to catch us unawares? Unfortunately, it was total surrender on their part. They obeyed the orders of their leaders.
Did you get the sense over time, as you were part of the occupying force, that the Japanese soldiers and the Japanese civilians were accepting what had happened?
Yes, there was no question about that. They were, I have to digress a minute, young Americans had no appreciation whatsoever of Oriental culture, with maybe rare exceptions. So when we got to Japan, we were totally unprepared for a people who were so totally obedient to the orders of their rulers, something that was basically, foreign to Americans and our way of life. We tend to obey our leaders, but at times we may, be a little bit uncertain whether we're going to do it wholeheartedly. In Japan, it was so clearly obvious that the word of the emperor was inviolable. I mean, there was just no thought of not doing what he had said, which was to surrender and to respect and honor the invading army, which is, totally foreign to Western culture. We could never do that in this country. We could never be told by our leaders, you will surrender, you will be respectful, and so forth. We'd back off into the hills with our rifles and fight. The Japanese, there was just no resistance at all. I mean, it was total, complete obedience to what their emperor and their government had said they would do. We were unprepared for that. And it was difficult to understand it. But for many of us, myself definitely, it was a totally impressive thing. I began to gain an appreciation of how a homogeneous people could be so united in a common cause, even though that cause in this particular case was something of an embarrassment, a total denial of their whole culture, which was, anti-surrender. It was, for a young 19-year-old lieutenant, it was an eye-opener.
Sir, let me hold you right there. We'll come right back with more of our conversation with retired U.S. Army Colonel Bill Weber right after this. Welcome back to Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corumbus, honored to be joined today by retired U.S. Army Colonel Bill Weber, a veteran of World War II and Korea. He is now chairman of the Korean War Veterans Memorial Foundation, and we'll obviously get to Korea in just a moment. Sir, there were nearly, of course, 5 years between the Japanese surrender and the onset of the Korean War. During those years, what were your duties mainly as you were part of the occupying force in Japan?
Well, I chose to stay with the occupation force, the 11th Airborne Division, other than being rotated back home, because I was interested in learning more about Japan and the Japanese people and their culture. Plus, it was good duty. I mean, to lead airborne soldiers is one of the finest jobs in the world. I mean, there's nothing like it. And I don't mean to suggest that leading non-airborne soldiers is not equally as good. It is. But airborne is just a cut above, simply because they have more verve, more eliteness. They feel they're top of the heap, and they act that way, and they soldier that way. So I stayed in Japan, and I eventually became a company commander of one of the rifle companies in the 187th then Paraglider Infantry Regiment. Although I did have one very exciting experience when we first moved to Hokkaido, the northern island of the Japanese island group. Excuse me. My regiment, the 187, and our artillery, the 674, was sent to Hokkaido to complete the occupation. The two American divisions that were there starting it were sent home. At that point in time, the Japanese military had not yet been totally demobilized. And Wakkanai, which is a port on the northern part of Hokkaido, was a major naval base. So I was sent up there with a rifle platoon to accept the surrender of that naval base and disarm it. It was commanded by a Japanese vice admiral, and he had about 2,000 what we would call naval infantry. There were 3 or 4 destroyers that were still combat ready in the harbor, in the fleet, and 1 cruiser that was not functional at that point in time. When we got there, I had also received instructions that don't disarm the Japanese right away, because it's possible that there was a fear that the Russians would attempt to infiltrate Hokkaido from Karafuto, which is the next island north. And as a matter of fact, during the period of time that I was there, which is a little less than a month, several small boatloads of Russian personnel did try and enter Hokkaido. I wouldn't call it an invasion, but it was exploratory, I would say. So we used the Japanese naval infantry to guard the shores, and they remained armed. And then about a month later, another platoon arrived to help, and we disarmed them. Well, they disarmed themselves, actually. We just supervised it. But it was an interesting interlude there, and later on, as I read about things, I realized that, yes, there was very definitely a Soviet-Russian attempt to become part of the occupation forces. They were denied such by MacArthur, but apparently they felt if they could gain a foothold in Hokkaido, that we wouldn't do anything to reject them. And of course, it's an unknown. It didn't happen, so it's not possible to say what would have happened had they been able to infiltrate into Hokkaido. Which, by the way, of all the Japanese islands, was the least one damaged per se. There are major cities like Sapporo, Sayagawa, Hakodate, Bihoro, which were, the last 2 were air bases, basically. Hakodate was also a port city. Were basically untouched. Apparently they weren't feasible targets or unreachable targets from the B-29s going from Okinawa. Apparently the distance north to Hokkaido was too far for them to make that round trip. In any event, it was basically undamaged. And the peasantry and the educated citizenry were equally submissive. I mean, even though they hadn't really truly experienced the ravages of war, except for food shortages and things of that nature.
Sir, just about a minute left before before we have to take another break. Where were you in June of 1950? And I guess more importantly, how did you hear about the fact that North Korea had invaded the South?
I was back in the States, back with the 11th Airborne Division and 187th then Airborne Infantry Regiment. And we were deployed by battalions conducting summer training for the ROTC. And my battalion, the 3rd Battalion, was at Fort Meade, Maryland. And the late afternoon of the 26th of June, U.S. time, we received information that there had been an altercation in Korea, and that we were alerted immediately to return to Fort Campbell, which we in effect did. We motor marched back to Fort Campbell and found out that we had been alerted to go to Korea. MacArthur had requested from the Joint Chiefs of Staff a full airborne division. They denied that request because they were uncertain as to whether or not the Soviet Union would take advantage of what was going on in Korea and attempt, to move across Western Europe. So the 82nd Airborne Division, which was the only then full division, fully staffed, ready to go, was maintained as strategic reserve. The 11th Airborne Division was at about half strength. So it wouldn't have served the purposes of what MacArthur wanted. So instead, the Department of Army said they would create an Airborne Regimental Combat Team. and send that to him. And his plan was that it would be used in conjunction with the Incheon operation. There would be an airborne landing followed by the invasion from sea.
Sir, let's stop right there just for a moment. We'll come back and pick up the story in Korea when we come back on Veterans Chronicles. My guest today on Veterans Chronicles is retired U.S. Army Colonel Bill Weber, veteran of World War II and Korea. He is the current chairman of the Korean War Veterans Memorial Foundation. And sir, just before our last break, you were talking about the strategy and build-up leading into the Incheon landing.
Yes. As I said, my regiment was alerted to go to form a regimental combat team, which meant adding a full battalion of artillery, a company of engineers and so forth to the infantry regiment. And that was the equivalent of 1/3 of an airborne division, combat-wise. And we departed from Fort Campbell, loaded out of San Francisco on troop carrier ships, and arrived in Japan in late August. We got there, but the aircraft and the parachutes that would have enabled us to make an airborne operation didn't get there at the same time. So the amphibious operation went on without the airborne element involved. But as soon as the airport had been, the airstrip had been captured, we were airlifted in to the area between Incheon and Seoul. And my battalion was attached to the 1st Marine Division for the battle for Seoul. And we remained attached to the 1st Marine Division until Seoul had been secured. And we went back to the air base and were alerted for a combat jump north of Pyongyang, which was the North Korean capital, with the mission of 3 missions, really. 1, cut off the escape of the infrastructure of the North Korean Army and the North Korean government, and rescue prisoners of war that we knew the North Koreans were going to be transporting to the north. We were due to jump at 0600, to take off at 0600 hours on the 19th of October. Unfortunately, the weather intervened, and we were delayed until 1400 hours, a delay of 8 hours. And when the weather cleared enough so that we could take off, C-119 aircraft, fly the route out to the sea north and then back into the drop zones north of Pyongyang. That 8-hour delay was a terrible and critical thing. 1, it permitted the bulk of the North Korean governmental infrastructure to evacuate north of our drop zones, which were 2 towns called Sukchon and Suncheon. And it also enabled the POW train to get out of Pyongyang and be proceeding north. When we jumped, the train was at the location of the 2nd drop zone for our 2nd Battalion. And the Koreans pulled the train into a tunnel while the jump was ongoing and massacred the prisoners. Over 140 were stabbed and beaten to death by the North Korean guards. Weather intervened, fate, it was a terrible thing. And of course, the basic mission was not achieved. We didn't stop the North Korean infrastructure, governmental infrastructure, from getting north, which allowed Kim Jong-il and all the others, to form their government again. And we didn't save the POWs.
It sounds like they knew you were coming. How did this delay if the mission wasn't?
No, they didn't know we were coming. That was a part of their plan, that they were going to evacuate Pyongyang anyhow.
Okay.
Had weather not intervened, we would have intercepted the trains that were moving north out of Pyongyang, which had the governmental infrastructure aboard. And we would have intercepted the POW train before it got to that drop zone. We would have been further south by then. But just, God's will. Things such as that happen in combat, over which you have no control. And sometimes it works to the good, and sometimes it works to the bad. And in this particular instance, our delay was a tragedy in a way as far as the POWs was concerned, and a strategic loss as far as not getting the infrastructure of the North Korean government, because it enabled them to get to the northern part of their country, reorganize, reform, reconstitute their armed force, and be something with which the Chinese government could negotiate and at least have the facade of saying that they were helping a friendly government when they decided to intervene.
October of 1950, you said, is when this happened. While that mission was certainly unsuccessful, that time was as the U.S. and the Allies were pushing pretty successfully up towards the Yalu River. And then, of course, it was Thanksgiving when the Chinese came across. Talk about those massive momentum swings. It looked like the war could be over by Christmas, and then all of a sudden, the Chinese are coming.
Yeah, basically that's correct. As history has recorded, the Chinese had warned the United Nations that while they would permit South Korean forces to go to the Yalu, they would not permit United Nations forces to go there for reasons far beyond my reasoning power then. MacArthur was successful in convincing Truman and the United Nations that he could successfully conquer the rest of Korea and that it would not endanger entry by the Chinese. He was wrong there. History, of course, has proven that. But when you research what had gone on at that time diplomatically, it was apparent that the Chinese had clearly signaled that if American forces continued to advance to the Yalu, they would enter the war, because there's no way the Chinese wanted the United States on their border, which occasioned their entry into the war. And in that, even though Stalin was not 100% in favor of it, he supported it because he felt it would further weaken the United States as far as Western Europe was concerned. Not that he entertained any thoughts of going into Western Europe. He thought it would implode by itself, like Italy was in danger of imploding to become communist at that point in time. And France was wavering. So the United States, however, feared that becoming embroiled in Korea with the Chinese, which had already happened, would allow the Soviet Union the ability to move across Western Europe, which is why for the United States, once the Chinese entered, it became a limited war. It no longer became a war that we were going to win per se by defeating the Chinese. It became a war in which we wanted to stabilize the situation basically where it had started, to be honest about it. History has proven that. Whether or not it was a definitive strategic policy at the time is difficult to uncover, but it is clear that MacArthur had brakes put on him, that we would bloody the Chinese, we would prevent them from occupying any part of South Korea, but we would not necessarily try and conquer North Korea again, i.e. to fight to a stalemate.
February 1951, the battle for Wanju changed your life forever. What happened?
Well, the Chinese had been stopped for their winter offensive, the November, December, January offensive, even though they had retaken Seoul and had crossed the Han River. But they, literally speaking, had run out of gas in the sense of the word, that they'd run out of their ability to resupply their troops, reorganize, and most importantly, reinforce them. So everything came to a sort of a static halt. There was no direct aggressive combat. There was frontline combat along the Imjin, but no attempt by either side to cross the Imjin. And the Chinese chose to build up north of Seoul and also in central Korea, north of Wanju. Their strategy being, because they knew the 8th Army was weakest at that point, their strategy being to break through there, get behind what was 10th Corps, and enfilade 1st and 9th Corps at the same time. In other words, they would have gotten behind 8th Army with the UN forces. And the road would have been open for them to go to Taegu, and from Taegu to Busan, or then known as Pusan, but today Busan. So Wanju was a critical rail and road junction, and it was necessary if you were going to have a major movement of troops further south, or as the case would be, north. So MacArthur ordered 8th Army that we would hold what was called the Wanju salient, and 2 American regiments, 27th Regiment at Chipyeong-ni, held, even though they were surrounded. The 38th Infantry at Hohensan was surrounded and broken, and the Chinese penetrated there. Well, Hohensan was on the main road to Wanju, and it was about 8 to 12 miles distance. And it was also the line of mountainous peaks just before the plains of Wanju. The Chinese had outposts on them already, and we were ordered to attack and take those pieces of ground so as to deny the Chinese the ability to control the ingress routes, which was a road and a railroad that ran through there, because they couldn't take their troops and equipment over the mountains. You know, you can take the troops over, but you can't bring the heavy equipment over. You got to have a trail to do that. Right. And the railroad and the road would have been it. By taking the high ground overlooking those 2 areas, we could deny them to the Chinese. We could also have measured and observed artillery support against them, and visible air support, where ground controllers could guide aircraft into areas of high concentration of Chinese. So anyhow, my regiment was ordered to take these hills, and we had been moved from the east coast to the center for that purpose. And when we assembled just south of Wanju, it was almost dark already, and so we were ordered to make a night attack. My company, and I was the company commander, we were given a mission of taking Hill 342, which was a key peak north of Wanju, and had observation over the road from Hohensan to Wanju, and on the other side from the railroad track. And there were companies on either side of us taking other peaks, co-located. So we started a night attack, and there were 2 intervening peaks, 340, 341, and then 342, and they step up. The Chinese had heavily fortified 342, and they had outposts on 341 and 340, which we took without any trouble at all. And then it was about 10 o'clock at night. I ordered my company to attack the 342, the main position, which was then occupied by about 2 companies of Chinese. And we successfully took the hill. They retreated to the base of the hill and were reinforced by a battalion and started a counterattack. And so the fight went on all night. Around midnight, 12:30, something like that, I got hit by a grenade and lost my arm. But the temperature was like 30 below zero. and bitter cold. So blood congealed immediately, which saved many lives, strangely enough, although some later froze to death. But basically, wounds would congeal almost immediately because it was so cold. That's what happened to me. It congealed. My first sergeant wrapped it up. I had no pain. So I continued to lead my company. And about an hour later, I got hit again and it took the leg, which of course then put me down. Long story short, my company held a hill. They beat off repeated attacks by a Chinese battalion, which numerical side was 4 times that of my company. That was left of my company. I already had about 37 casualties on the hill, dead and wounded, and they were the key leaders, the squad leaders, platoon leaders. They're the ones that get hit first because of their location and what they're doing. But my company held the hill. When daylight came, 342 still belonged to K Company, the 187th, and it was never lost after that. And our other companies from the battalion and regiment were equally successful. We held that line. That bottled up the Chinese, and the next day, which was a clear day, the Air Force and 10th Corps Artillery absolutely decimated them. I mean, they were trapped in these enclaves and valleys where they had come down off the mountaintops to try and pass through the road network and the rail network. And we had bottled that up by taking these hills because we could put direct artillery fire on them. They couldn't go through. So over 27,000 of them were packed up there in an area not much more than 5 or 6 miles in distance. And of course, it was spread out over the hills. And they actually got decimated with the air and artillery fire. It was just a turkey shoot, a terrible taking of human life. But it stunted their drive. And it has become known as the Chinese Gettysburg. Because from that moment on, the Chinese leadership realized that they were not going to be able to retake or to even try and take South Korea. And they would never push the United Nations forces, basically the United States, off the peninsula. So for them it became a war of attrition numerically and politically. It dragged on for 2 more years. Half our casualties in Korea occurred while peace talks were ongoing. The height of diplomatic asininity, in retrospect, okay? Sure. And perhaps even then, because the Chinese and North Koreans were rigid in their unwillingness to give anything, even though ultimately they knew they had to, since there was no way they were going to change the basic front lines as they were then established. I mean, the United Nations had the power to hold it. The South Korean military had been built up dramatically. They were good soldiers then. They had 12 divisions involved at that point in time, equal to American divisions as far as combat power is concerned. So there's no way that the Chinese could successfully eject the United Nations from Korea. And they knew then that the war would end with a sputter at some agreed upon line, which was basically in position at that point in time, except for some high ground line, back and forth. They would take it, we'd take it back, they'd take it, we'd take it back, just killing zones. They were prepared to risk their soldiers' lives, and we had no alternative because we couldn't let them gain an advantage. So, as I said, 50% of our casualties occurred while peace talks were ongoing. And
amazing. Sir, let's pause right there for just a moment. We'll come back with one final segment on Veterans Chronicles. Welcome back to the final segment of Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corumbus, honored to be joined in studio today by retired U.S. Army Colonel Bill Weber, veteran of both World War II and the Korean War. He is now chairman of the Korean War Veterans Memorial Foundation. Sir, I do want to talk about your work with the foundation in just a moment, but for our listeners wondering about the recovery that you went through after losing an arm and a leg at Wanju, what was that process like?
well, of course, I was evacuated to the States. I went to Person Jones Army Hospital, which was an amputee center then for the Army. I spent from March of 51 to December of 52 there, rehabilitating, being fitted with prostheses, and I requested to remain on active duty, which was not a policy at the time. However, the Army was critically short of experienced company-grade infantry officers for, training young officers that graduate from Annapolis or from West Point or from ROTC or from Officer Candidate School to condition them for combat, where you use combat experienced officers to do that. So I was retained on active duty as a test case. I was the only double amputee on active duty in the Army at the time. And I went to Fort Benning, Georgia to teach leadership to young officers. I was successful in that. I established that an amputee could exist in an active duty environment doing the duties co-equal to his counterparts, with some minor exceptions, but that it was a feasible program that experienced personnel, both enlisted and officers, who were necessary for the Army's needs, could be retained on active duty and serve well. I remained an infantry officer for the remainder of my career, although obviously most of my duties were staff-type duties. I went through all the schooling, Command and General Staff College, Armed Forces Staff College, Army War College. My last almost 9 years were at the Pentagon, and doing senior staff work. I developed several programs during the Vietnam War for the conservation of our enlisted troop strength. Since it wasn't a declared war, there was always an end strength limitation on the size of the Army, military forces in general, but the Army particularly. So we had to have some way of separating soldiers who had served their tour in Vietnam and bringing in their place a new draftee or enlistee on board to train them to go to Vietnam. And that was a very difficult process because most of the draftees who went to Vietnam and returned to the United States only had 17 months of service when they hit the United States. And under the law, you can't early release a soldier unless he's got 18 months of service and still give him full benefits. So we had to retain those soldiers on duty, which was a ridiculous thing, but since there wasn't a war declared and we were under basically peacetime law, the law as far as draftees were concerned was such that you had to have 18 months service before you could be early released and get all your benefits. So these soldiers came home from Nam with 17 months service, and we had to keep them in the Army. That meant we couldn't draft someone or enlist someone to replace them, train them, and send them to Vietnam. So I came up with a program where there was a voluntary extension of tours in Vietnam by soldiers for 1 month. And that way, when they deported from Vietnam and hit the States, they had 18 months service, we could early release them. Now, stop and think for a minute. You're a combat soldier in Vietnam. You've served your 1 year, and we're asking you to stay 1 more month to take a chance of getting killed. obviously that was, you know, a terrible decision for them to make. So we had to find some way of getting them out of combat. So there were a lot of rear areas, and that's where most of these young troopers went for 30 days, and then we sent them home and discharged them when they got to California.
Sir, we're just about out of time. I hate to cut you off, but I know you're very passionate. You're, as we've said many times, the chairman of the Korean War Veterans Memorial Foundation. You were part of the advisory board created by President Reagan. Yes. That eventually led to the creation of the Korean War Memorial on the Mall in downtown Washington. But I know your foundation believes that the memorial is not complete. Briefly explain what you would like to see added there.
Well, we have two bills working in Congress, H.R. 1475 in the House and S. 1982 in the Senate, which will allow us to add a wall of remembrance to the Korean War Veterans Memorial, on which we can list the names of our dead, the numbers of our wounded, our prisoners of war numbers, and those of our comrades in arms from the South Korean forces and from United Nations forces. The public law which authorized the Korean War Veterans Memorial specifically stated that its purpose was to honor those who served in combat in Korea, particularly those who were killed in action, missing in action, or prisoners of war. The board that I was appointed to by President Reagan, which you mentioned, we tried desperately to have a wall of names included in the memorial. But at that particular point in time, the very agonizing controversy about the Vietnam Memorial was ongoing. Those soldiers from Vietnam who returned home felt that their wall honored only their dead, didn't honor their service. So they didn't like the Vietnam Wall. The compromise was arrived at by adding the three soldier sculpture and the nurses memorial. And that eased the agony of those who served in Vietnam and returned home. But during that controversy, we were going through the system in Washington, D.C., through the National Capital Memorial Commission, the National Capital Planning Commission, the Fine Arts Commission, all of which have approval rights of what goes on the Grand Mall. And there was so much ill feeling about a name wall that there was no possibility that these agencies who had to approve the design we wanted would allow us to have a wall of names. The alternative was a number of casualties on the foot base in the alcove of the memorial, an area which is totally unrecognized by visitors. People who come to the Korean Memorial are justifiably awed by its magnificent artistry. And that's what it is, a magnificent work of art. I'm proud to have been a part of its development. But what it is not is a memorial, because the requirement to honor both service and sacrifice is missing in that memorial. It honors service, but it doesn't honor sacrifice because it is an unknown to the visitor. It helps to make the Korean War a forgotten war in American history, because nobody has ever had it brought to their attention what that war cost. It was, in terms of percentage of casualties, the bloodiest foreign war America has ever fought. If you fought in Korea, you stood 1 chance in 9 of being killed or wounded, versus 1 in 12 in World War II and 1 in 17 in Vietnam. Now, of course, the number of casualties are different in Vietnam and Korea, but your chances of being killed or wounded were greater if you were in Korea. And it was trench warfare, more in tune with World War I than World War II. There were no massive encirclements. You know, you were talking about a peninsula 160 miles wide, average. And at the height of the war, on the enemy side of the peninsula were 1.5 million Koreans and Chinese. And on the friendly side, UN side, about 900 and some odd thousand South Koreans, UN, and American forces. Nowhere in World War II, on any front, in any theater, did an American army face that many enemy on a 160-mile frontage. Okay? That's lost in American history. It's lost to the people who even know about the Korean War. It's a tragedy that one of the greatest things our country did to go to help a people when we weren't threatened, the very essence of what our democracy is all about, that someone must pay the price for freedom. We chose to do it in Korea, and we don't acknowledge it in the history of our country. It's not even a 5-paragraph war anymore in history books in high schools or in universities, okay? It's basically a 2-paragraph war, almost entirely dedicated to the Truman-MacArthur controversy and the politics that resulted therefrom. Yeah, I'm spending the remainder of my life, which is not going to be very long now, I'm going to be 90 in 2 months, trying somehow to add to the Korean Memorial so that we make it a memorial not only to service but also sacrifice. We have 2 bills in Congress, as I mentioned. We got 154 co-sponsors on the House side. We only have the 2 co-sponsors right now on the Senate side because the Congress is not in session. Mm-hmm. When they return, I think we're going to pick up co-sponsors very quickly. I feel this is our 3rd Congress to try and make this happen. I think we're going to make it this time. And we have a commitment from a Korean businessman for $10 million, which is only half, or perhaps less than half of what we'll need to build the memorial now. 6 years ago, we could have built it for 10. Now it's going to be maybe 24. And we still got the problem of getting agreement with all the agencies in the District of Columbia that have control over what goes on the mall as to what we want the wall to look like. The only thing that will be guaranteed by the law is that it will be a glass wall, and somehow we have to list the names of the dead. But that's not the total intent we have for the wall, because we want that wall to also acknowledge the fact that we were part of a world effort, and that we didn't do it alone, and that was the first time the United Nations took arms against an aggressor. Surely that deserves being acknowledged in the history of our country and in a memorial which is supposed to honor that war and those who fought it. I hope God lets me live to see it happen if it does.
Sir, unfortunately our time is up. Thank you so much for your service. We should point out that actually one of the soldiers at the memorial, his face is based on your face. So that is certainly a tribute to you and your...
That was one of the honors that the sculptor accorded to those of us, because he was a paratrooper in World War II also in the 70th Airborne, so we clinched right away. You know? For 8 years we worked together.
Colonel Weber, thank you for your service. Thank you for your time with us today, sir. We greatly appreciate it.
You're more than welcome. My pleasure.
Retired U.S. Army...
I hope I gave you what you wanted.
Oh, absolutely. Let me just finish this quick wrap-up and we'll be on our way here. Our guest has been retired U.S. Army Colonel William Bill Weber. He is a veteran of World War II, veteran of the Korean War, and he is now the chairman of the Korean War Veterans Memorial Foundation. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Veterans Chronicles.